There are places in this world where the veil between what we know and what we fear grows thin. Places where the whispers of ancient earth meet the screams of the lost. And deep within the heartland of America, cloaked in emerald green and perpetual shadow, lies one such place, the Hoosier National Forest. It spans over 200,000 acres across the rugged, rolling hills of southern Indiana. To the casual eye, it is a sanctuary of breathtaking natural beauty. Towering hardwoods reach for the sky, their branches forming a cathedral ceiling, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Pristine streams carve their way through ancient rock formations, their gentle gurgle a constant lullaby. Deer roam freely, their cautious steps barely disturbing the rich tapestry of fallen leaves. It is, by all accounts, a magnificent testament to nature's enduring power. A haven for hikers, campers, and all who seek solace in the wild. But beauty, as we know, often hides a deeper truth. A truth whispered in the rustling leaves when no wind blows, felt in the sudden, inexplicable chill that sweeps through a sunlit glade. For those who truly listen, the Hoosier National Forest hums with a different kind of energy, an energy born from centuries of untold stories, of life lived and, in some cases, terrifyingly extinguished within its vast, unforgiving embrace. The locals, those who have lived for generations on its fringes, speak of it with a peculiar mix of reverence and apprehension. They'll tell you about the stunning vistas, the untouched wilderness, the perfect escape from the clamor of modern life. But if you listen closely, if you press them gently enough, their voices will drop. Their eyes will shift, perhaps to the distant tree line, or to the shadows deepening around them. And then they'll tell you about the other side of Hoosier. They'll speak of trails that seem to disappear and reappear, of compasses spinning wildly, of voices mimicking loved ones, luring the unwary deeper. They'll share hushed tales of unexplained phenomena, strange lights dancing among the pines where no human settlement exists, fleeting figures glimpsed in the peripheral vision, and an overwhelming sense of dread that descends without warning. And most chilling of all, they'll speak of the disappearances. People, experienced outdoorsmen, families, young adventurers who ventured into its depths and were never seen again. Their belongings sometimes found, sometimes not. Their fates forever etched into the silent, watchful trees. The official reports are often inconclusive. Lost, presumed deceased, accidental fall, hypothermia. But the whispers persist. The unsolved cases accumulate, forming a grim tapestry woven into the very fabric of the forest's history. For every beautiful vista, there is a forgotten grave. For every babbling brook, a silent scream. So, when we speak of the Hoosier National Forest, we speak not just of its natural grandeur, but of its shadowy heart, a heart that beats with an ancient, primal rhythm, indifferent to human ambition, yet strangely attentive to human fear. It poses a chilling question to all who dare to enter its domain. What truly lurks within these seemingly tranquil woods? What ancient, malevolent force lies dormant, waiting to awaken when the veil grows thin, when human curiosity pushes too far, or when unsuspecting souls stray onto a path they were never meant to walk? Our story begins not with ancient spirits or shadowy figures, but with 5 friends, bound by a shared love for the wild and an insatiable craving for adventure. They were seasoned hikers, not novices, their backpacks filled with state-of-the-art gear, their minds sharp with years of outdoor experience. First, there was Mark, the undisputed leader of the group. Mark was a veteran wilderness guide, his tanned face etched with the wisdom of countless trails. Always pragmatic, always prepared, he was the anchor that kept the others grounded. His enthusiasm for the outdoors was infectious, but beneath his jovial exterior lay a keen sense of caution, honed by years of respecting nature's unpredictable power. Then came Sarah. An environmental scientist, Sarah brought an intellectual curiosity to their expeditions. She was observant, meticulous, and always the first to point out an unusual plant or a subtle shift in the ecosystem. Her skepticism was a healthy counterbalance to the group's more adventurous impulses, often reminding them of logical explanations for strange occurrences. She carried a profound respect for the natural world, understanding its delicate balance far better than most. Jake was the group's lighthearted joker, the one who kept spirits high with his endless supply of anecdotes and terrible puns. A software engineer by trade, he loved disconnecting from the digital world and immersing himself in nature. Beneath his easygoing demeanor, however, lay a surprising resilience and a fiercely protective instinct for his friend. He was also the one most likely to pull out his phone for a quick selfie, even in the most remote locations. Chloe, a freelance photographer, saw the world through a lens. Every leaf, every ray of sunlight, every ripple in a stream was a potential masterpiece. She was adventurous, daring, always pushing the boundaries to get the perfect shot. Her artistic eye, while a blessing for capturing beauty, sometimes led her to stray just a little too far from the group, chasing a fleeting moment of visual splendor. Finally, there was Ben, the youngest of the group. Ben was an avid cryptozoology enthusiast, fascinated by legends and folklore. He was the one who first suggested the Hoosier National Forest, drawn by the whispers of its dark history and the numerous unsolved disappearances. A true believer in the unknown, his eagerness to prove the existence of something beyond human comprehension made him both an exciting and a slightly unsettling companion on these trips. He carried not just his hiking gear, but also a digital recorder and a healthy dose of hopeful anticipation for the supernatural. Their plan was ambitious. A 3-day, 2-night trek into a particular remote section of the Hoosier, far from the well-trodden paths. Mark had meticulously planned their route, relying on detailed topographical maps and satellite imagery to chart a course through an area rumored to contain ancient, rarely visited indigenous sites. The goal was to reach an untouched overlook, known only to a few, where they could witness a breathtaking sunrise before making their descent. It was a challenge, a test of their skills and endurance, a deep dive into the wilderness they all cherished. They had checked their gear multiple times: sturdy tents, ample food and water, first aid kits, powerful flashlights, and reliable communication devices. Every precaution had been taken, every contingency considered. They were prepared for anything the natural world could throw at them. But they were about to discover that the Hoosier National Forest held forces far beyond the realm of their experience. Forces that defied logic and shattered sanity. Forces that had been waiting patiently in the deep, green silence for just such a group of curious, confident adventurers to stray from the known path. The morning of their departure dawned crisp and clear, a perfect prelude to adventure. The air, cool and fresh, carried the invigorating scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight, still soft, filtered through the canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. With spirits high, the 5 friends began their ascent into the heart of the Hoosier National Forest. The initial miles were exhilarating, filled with the easy camaraderie of shared passion. Jake cracked jokes. Chloe stopped frequently to capture breathtaking shots of dew-kissed spiderwebs and sunlight-drenched clearings. And Ben, ever the enthusiast, pointed out formations he believed hinted at ancient energy points. Mark, leading the way, maintained a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, while Sarah quietly observed the flora and fauna, occasionally taking notes. The forest unveiled its beauty in layers. Towering oak and maple trees provided a majestic ceiling, their leaves a vibrant tapestry of green. The sounds were a symphony of nature. The rhythmic crunch of boots on fallen leaves, the distant call of a hawk, the cheerful chirping of unseen birds, and the gentle gurgle of a winding stream they followed for a time. It was everything they had hoped for, an escape, a challenge, a profound connection with the wild. But as the morning wore on and they pushed deeper into the less traveled sections, a subtle shift began. It wasn't anything overt, nothing one could immediately point to. It was a feeling, a whisper at the edge of perception. Sarah, with her acute observational skills, was the first to notice the unnatural quiet that occasionally fell over certain pockets of the woods, a silence too profound for a healthy forest. The birdsong would cease abruptly, only to resume moments later, a disquieting interruption in the natural symphony. Chloe, focused on her photography, sometimes felt an inexplicable chill pass through her, even in the warmth of the midday Sunday. She'd glance up, convinced she'd seen a fleeting shadow dart between trees in her peripheral vision, only to find nothing but dense foliage. Jake, for all his lightheartedness, swore he caught a faint, metallic tang in the air, like old blood or rusted iron, a scent that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. He tried to joke about it, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. Ben, ever attuned to the unusual, was fascinated by how their GPS signals seemed to fluctuate more than expected. Not a complete loss, but intermittent jumps and shifts that made their precise location momentarily uncertain. Mark, ever the pragmatist, simply attributed it to the dense canopy and the remote terrain. Standard for deep woods, Ben, he reassured him, though even Mark found himself double-checking his compass more often than usual. As they pressed on, the feeling of being watched began to subtly permeate the group. Not a malicious stare, but an unseen presence, a heavy awareness that made the hairs on the back of their necks tingle. It was as if the ancient trees themselves were turning their gaze upon these intruders, their collective consciousness observing every step. The beauty of the forest remained, but now it was tinged with an undercurrent of something ancient, something patient, waiting. The air, once invigorating, now carried a faint, unsettling hum, a vibration that resonated deep within their bones, a prelude to the unknown that lay ahead. As dusk began to paint the sky with hues of purple and orange, Mark led the group to a clearing he had scouted on his maps, a secluded spot nestled beside a trickling spring, surrounded by ancient, towering pines. The location felt remote, utterly cut off from the human world, a perfect spot for an undisturbed night under the stars. They worked efficiently, setting up their tents in a horseshoe pattern, gathering firewood, and preparing a simple meal. The crackle of their small campfire provided a comforting focal point against the encroaching gloom, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The initial feeling of unease from the daytime had softened, replaced by the familiar ritual of making camp. The aroma of instant coffee mingled with the earthy scent of the forest, and the gentle murmur of their conversation created a fragile bubble of normalcy. Jake, true to form, pulled out a harmonica and played a slightly off-key rendition of an old folk tune, bringing a smile to everyone's faces. Sarah and Chloe shared stories from past trips, while Ben quietly observed the deepening shadows, a hopeful glint in his eye for any sign of the supernatural. Mark, ever vigilant, scanned the perimeter occasionally, his headlamp sweeping across the dark edges of the clearing. But as the last vestiges of twilight faded and the stars began to pinprick the inky canvas above, the sense of isolation intensified. The familiar forest sounds, the chirping crickets, the rustling of small creatures seemed amplified in the profound silence of their secluded spot. It was a silence that felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken things. It was Ben, the cryptozoology enthusiast, who experienced the first undeniable incident. He had wandered a little away from the campfire, drawn by the urge to relieve himself and perhaps to capture some ambient night sounds on his digital recorder. As he stood amongst the cluster of thick ferns, with the campfire a warm glow some 50 yards behind him, he heard it. Ben? The voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet distinctly clear. It was Sarah's voice, unmistakable in its gentle query, tinged with a slight curiosity. Ben turned, expecting to see her approaching through the trees. "Yeah, Sarah?" he called back, but saw nothing. The ferns remained undisturbed. "Ben, are you okay?" The voice came again, closer this time, just beyond the thicket. There was a faint hint of concern now. Confused, Ben took a step forward, peering into the deeper darkness. Sarah, is that you? Why are you way out here? There was no response. The woods were utterly silent again, save for the thumping of his own heart. He waited, straining his ears, but heard nothing more. Feeling a prickle of unease, he quickly made his way back to the campfire. Sarah was seated exactly where he left her, stirring her cup of coffee. Mark was tending the fire. Jake was still fiddling with his harmonica. Chloe was examining a photo on her camera. "Hey, Sarah," Ben said, trying to sound casual. "Did you just call me?" Sarah looked up, a puzzled expression on her face. "Call you? No, why? Everything all right?" A cold knot formed in Ben's stomach. He glanced at the others. No one else seemed to have noticed anything. Mark, sensing his change in demeanor, asked, "Something wrong, Ben?" Ben hesitated, then shook his head, forcing a smile. "Nah, just thought I heard something. Must be the echoes out here." He tried to rationalize it, convincing himself it was fatigue, or perhaps just his eager imagination playing tricks on him in the deep woods he had so longed to explore. But deep down, he knew. He knew what he had heard, and it was no echo. It was a voice that wasn't supposed to be there, and he knew his name. Despite Ben's feigned casualness, a subtle shift had occurred around the campfire. A thread of unspoken unease wove itself into the group's dynamic, making their laughter sound a little less genuine, their conversations a little more forced. Mark, ever observant, noticed Ben occasionally glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight, a telltale sign of lingering apprehension. Sarah seemed to pick up on it too, her keen scientific mind already searching for anomalies. As the hours drifted towards midnight, the campfire dwindled to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and contorted into grotesque shapes. The sounds of the forest, once a soothing symphony, now seemed to press in on them, each rustle and snap of a twig amplified by the profound darkness. It was during this time that the whispers began to intensify. At first, they were barely perceptible, blending with the ambient sounds of the night. A faint, unintelligible murmur, like distant conversations carried on a phantom breeze. But then, they grew clearer, more distinct. Not just random sounds, but a cacophony of hushed voices, overlapping and indistinguishable, yet undeniably there. It was as if the very air around them had become thick with unseen speakers, their secrets shared just beyond the threshold of human understanding. Chloe, bundled in her sleeping bag, was the first to vocalize it this time. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice a hushed tremor. "It sounds like talking." Jake, who had been trying to doze off, sat up abruptly. "Yeah, I heard it. Thought it was just the wind. But it's almost like a crowd." Mark, ever the pragmatist, grabbed his powerful headlamp and swept its beam across the surrounding trees. "Probably just the wind playing tricks in the pines. Or maybe some nocturnal animals," he stated, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He strained his ears, and even he couldn't deny the unsettling quality of the sound. It was too regular, too varied, to be mere wind. Then the lights appeared. From deep within the forest, beyond the reach of their campfire's glow, a faint, flickering light emerged. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight, nor the gentle pulse of fireflies. It was sharper, more erratic, appearing and disappearing in quick, unnatural flashes, like distant camera flashes or faulty electrical sparks, moving through the dense undergrowth. "What in the hell is that?" Ben whispered, his earlier skepticism completely gone, replaced by wide-eyed fascination and dread. Sarah, ever the scientist, tried to apply logic. Could be some other campers? Though Mark said this area was supposed to be completely isolated. Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. No other groups were registered for this sector, and those lights, they're moving too erratically, too low to the ground for headlamps. The flickering lights continue their strange dance for several minutes, sometimes converging, sometimes separating, moving deeper into the woods, then circling back towards the edges of their clearing, but never quite venturing close enough to reveal their source. The whispers seemed to respond to the lights, growing louder, more agitated, a strange chorus of unseen entities communicating in the impenetrable darkness. A genuine unease settled over the group now, too potent to be dismissed as fatigue or imagination. The jovial atmosphere of their first day had completely evaporated. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a vast, living entity, aware of their presence and perhaps not at all welcoming. Sleep felt like a dangerous luxury. They huddled closer to the dying embers, their eyes glued to the dark tree line, waiting for something, anything, to reveal itself. The night, they realized, was just getting started. The second day dawned with a thick, oppressive fog clinging to the forest, obscuring visibility and muting the vibrant colors of the woods. It mirrored the mood of the group, which was distinctly subdued after a restless night. Sleep had been fitful, haunted by the memory of unseen whispers and dancing lights. Despite the lingering apprehension, Mark, ever the leader, urged them to pack up. "We've lost enough time," he announced. "We need to make up ground if we want to reach the overlook by tomorrow morning." Their goal for the day was to navigate a particularly dense section of the forest, aiming for a less defined game trail that, according to Mark's meticulous maps, will lead them towards higher ground. The initial miles were slow, the fog making every step uncertain. The usual cheerful banter was replaced by terse instructions and an unsettling silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. It was roughly an hour into their trek that the first undeniable problem arose. Mark, consulting his GPS and topographical map, stopped abruptly. "This isn't right," he muttered, his brow furrowed. "The trail should be bearing west here." But he looked around, then back at his instruments. The faint path they were on seemed to curve sharply north, a direction entirely inconsistent with their planned route. Sarah stepped forward, pulling out her own highly calibrated GPS device. Her face grew pale as she stared at the screen. "Mine's saying the same thing, Mark. We're off course. Way off. It's like the trail just veered." A ripple of unease, far colder than the fog, spread through the group. Jake tried to joke, "Maybe the forest just got tired of us going in a straight line." But his laugh was hollow. Ben, ever alert, pointed to a large, distinctive moss-covered boulder Mark had marked as a waypoint. That boulder was supposed to be further back, wasn't it? Or are we somehow circling? Mark, usually unflappable, rechecked everything. He pulled out his physical compass. It spun wildly for a few seconds before settling, pointing vaguely southeast, a direction entirely unhelpful given their supposed trajectory. "This is impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. "My compass has never done this." Frustration began to brew, quickly turning into accusations. "Did anyone tamper with the GPS settings?" Jake asked, his eyes darting to Ben, who was known for experimenting with tech. Ben bristled. "Of course not. Why would I?" Chloe, observing the same strange tree formations repeating themselves, whispered, "I think Ben might be right, Mark. We've been here before. I recognize that twisted oak. We're going in circles, aren't we?" The realization hit them like a physical blow. They had been walking for hours, yet somehow the forest had subtly manipulated their path, diverting them, confusing them. It wasn't just a wrong turn. It felt deliberate. The familiar layout of the woods, which Mark had studied for months, was gone, replaced by a disorienting labyrinth of identical trees and indistinct paths. They shouted, hoping for an echo, a response. But the thick fog seemed to absorb all sound. A quiet blame began to fester. Mark felt the weight of leadership, his meticulous planning seemingly worthless. Sarah, usually so logical, found no scientific explanation. Jake's jokes died on his lips. Chloe gripped her camera tight, no longer seeing beauty but an oppressive, manipulative force. Ben, the one who sought the supernatural, now felt a chill that went beyond mere fascination. The forest wasn't just silent. It was actively working against them, hurting them, pushing them deeper into its incomprehensible depths. The disorientation had left the group frayed and irritable. After nearly an hour of backtracking and confused deliberation, Mark finally declared a temporary halt. "We need to reevaluate," he stated, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Let's just take 5, collect ourselves." The decision was met with weary nods. The fog still hung heavy, making it difficult to gain any perspective, and the unsettling quiet that Sarah had noticed earlier had become almost constant. It was during this tense pause that Jake, who had been unusually quiet since their compass issues, spoke up. "I really need to use the facilities," he mumbled, glancing nervously at the dense foliage. "I'll just be a minute. Keep an eye on my pack." He placed his backpack carefully beside a fallen log and, without waiting for a reply, quickly disappeared into the thick undergrowth, just a short distance from where the others rested. Initially, no one thought much of it. It was a common occurrence on any long hike. Chloe checked her camera, Sarah reviewed her notes, and Mark studied his map with a grim expression. Ben, however, found his gaze drifting to the spot where Jake had vanished. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. The silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on them. "Jake's taking his sweet time," Chloe remarked, trying to inject some levity, but her voice faltered. Mark, feeling the familiar prickle of unease, looked up from his map. He should be back by now. He called out, "Jake, you all right?" Only the silence of the forest answered. A cold dread began to seep into their bones. Mark, grabbing his hiking poles, moved cautiously towards where Jake had entered the trees. "Jake, this isn't funny," he called, his voice louder now, laced with a growing urgency. Sarah and Chloe exchanged worried glances, their faces pale in the misty light. Ben stood frozen, his eyes wide. They followed the faint path Jake had made just moments ago. The fog swirled, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. After pushing through a curtain of ferns, they stopped dead. There, resting against the base of an ancient oak, was Jake's backpack. It was upright, exactly as he left it. But Jake was nowhere to be seen. There were no tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle, no broken twigs or disturbed leaves beyond the faint path he had initially made. It was as if he had simply evaporated. "Jake," Mark roared, his voice cracking with sudden panic. He rushed forward, frantically scanning the surrounding trees. "Jake, where are you?" Sarah ran to the backpack, her hands trembling as she opened it. Everything was inside: his water bottle, a half-eaten granola bar, his emergency whistle. "He didn't even take his water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chloe began to hyperventilate, tears welling in her eyes. This isn't real. This can't be real. Ben, who had always chased the supernatural, now faced it head-on. He stood utterly still, straining his ears. And then, faintly, carried on a phantom breath of wind, he heard it, a soft, chilling sound, like a child's mocking giggle, echoing from deep within the impenetrable depths of the forest, before vanishing into the profound silence. True, unadulterated panic setting. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't an accident. Jake hadn't just gotten lost. Something had taken him, and it was still out there, lurking, watching, and laughing. The mocking giggle, if it was indeed a giggle, vanished as quickly as it came, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down them. Panic, raw and unyielding, seized the remaining 4. Mark, though his face was pale and drawn, fought to regain control. Okay, everybody calm down," he urged, his voice trembling slightly. "We need to search. We stick together. Spread out just a little, keep visual contact, and shout his name." They began to call out, their voices hoarse with fear. "Jake! Jake!" The names echoed hollowly in the thick fog, swallowed by the dense canopy and the oppressive quiet of the forest. There was no response, no rustle of leaves that wasn't their own, no distant reply. It was as if Jake had never existed, wiped from the face of the earth. Sarah, her scientific mind desperately trying to process the impossible, began systematically scanning the ground. "There has to be a trace," she muttered, her eyes darting over fallen leaves and damp soil. "Something. Anything." Chloe, tears streaming down her face, stumbled along, clutching her camera like a lifeline, her previous artistic eye now seeing only terror in every twisted branch. Ben, surprisingly, was the most focused. The initial shock had given way to a grim determination, fueled by his fascination with the unknown. He moved with a quiet intensity, peering into every shadow. As they pushed deeper into the area where Jake had disappeared, the forest seemed to grow denser, the trees twisting into more gnarled and ancient forms. The light, already dim due to the fog, barely penetrated the canopy, creating a perpetual twilight. Their calls for Jake became more frantic, more desperate, but the only response was the unnerving sensation of being completely alone yet undeniably watched. Then Ben stopped abruptly. He pointed to a small patch of damp earth, slightly softer than the surrounding forest floor. "Look," he whispered, his voice barely audible. There, etched into the mud, were tracks, but they weren't human. Not exactly. They were elongated, almost paw-like, with long, slender digits. Yet they suggested a bipedal creature. They were too large for any known animal in the region, too distinct from any human footprint. And most unsettlingly, they were deep, as if whatever made them carried immense weight. Yet they seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. They didn't seem to have a clear beginning or end, just that were. Mark knelt, his face grim. "What in God's name?" he breathed, tracing the outline with a trembling finger. "This isn't a bear. It's not a wolf." His outdoor expertise offered no explanation. Chloe gasped, pointing further ahead. "And there, look at the branches." They followed her gaze. Higher up on some smaller trees, well above human reach, branches were snapped clean, not broken by the wind, but twisted and torn as if by enormous, unseen hands. Some bark was scraped away, revealing fresh, pale wood beneath, too high for any ordinary animal. It suggested immense power and unnatural strength. A heavy atmosphere of dread settled over them, suffocating them more than the fog. The forest was no longer just a place of beauty and challenge. It was an active, malevolent entity toying with them. The tracks, the broken branches, the profound silence, all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Jake wasn't just lost. He had been taken by something impossible, something that lived and hunted within the heart of the Hoosier, a creature whose very existence defied everything they thought they knew about the natural world. And now, that creature had left its mark, a chilling calling card to the remaining survivors. The discovery of the tracks and the violently snapped branches shattered the last remnants of their rational world. Jake hadn't wandered off. He had been hunted. Driven by a desperate, primal fear, their search became less about finding their friend and more about understanding the impossible thing that had taken him. They pushed forward, deeper into the fog-shrouded woods, drawn by a horrifying, unspoken logic that the tracks, though vanishing, were leading them somewhere. The forest around them continued to change. The trees grew older, their bark thick and dark like scarred hide, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out what little light penetrated the fog. The air grew still and cold, heavy with the smell of damp stone and decay. It was Sarah, the scientist, who noticed it first. The silence. It was absolute. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. The entire soundscape of the forest had been erased. It was in the heart of this dead silence that they found it. Pushing through a curtain of thick, ancient vines, they stumbled into a clearing they were clearly not meant to see. It was a perfect circle, unnaturally so, ringed by a series of jagged black stones, each the height of a man. They were slick with moss and half swallowed by the earth. Yet they radiated a palpable aura of immense age and malevolent purpose. "My God," Chloe whispered, her camera hanging uselessly at her side. "What is this place?" They stepped into the circle, and the cold intensified, seeping into their bones. Mark ran a hand over the surface of one of the stones, his face a mask of disbelief. But it was Ben, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and grim validation, who saw the carvings. Etched deep into the stone were figures that defied sanity. They were grotesque parodies of life, depicting tall, impossibly thin entities with elongated limbs, matching the tracks they had found, and hollow, empty sockets where their eyes should be. In scene after horrifying scene, these entities were shown standing over smaller, clearly human figures who were bold in attitudes of terror or worship. The carvings depicted rituals, offerings, and sacrifices made to these silent, watching gods of the forest. Sarah traced one of the carvings with a trembling finger. This isn't in any historical record. No known indigenous tribe from this area created art like this. Then, at the base of the central, largest stone, they saw it. A single, fresh scuff mark in the mud. It was unmistakably from the tread of Jake's hiking boot. The horrifying truth crashed down upon them. This wasn't just a historical site. It was active. They hadn't just stumbled upon a forgotten relic. They had walked into a temple, a place of sacrifice. And the forest had just brought its latest offering. The sight of Jake's boot print in that unholy place broke the spell of frozen terror. A single guttural sound escaped Mark's throat. "Run." It was a command born not of leadership, but of pure animal panic. They scrambled out of the stone circle, turning their backs on the grotesque carvings, and plunged back into the woods. They didn't care about a path or a plan. The only objective was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and that ancient malevolent altar. But the forest had other ideas. The moment they left the clearing, the oppressive silence they had grown used to shattered. But it was not replaced by the familiar sounds of nature. Instead, a cacophony of menacing noises rose around them. The whispers returned, no longer faint murmurs on the wind, but a constant, venomous hissing that seemed to emanate from the very bark of the trees. The fog grew impossibly thick, and the shadows within it deepened, writhing like living things at the edge of their vision. Trees that had been distant now loomed directly in their path, their branches seeming to twist and reach for them like gnarled claws. They ran blindly, stumbling over roots, until exhaustion and despair forced them to a halt in a small, suffocating glade. Gasping for breath, they looked at each other, and the psychological toll of the last 24 hours finally boiled over. "This is your fault," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she rounded on Ben. Tears streamed down her face, her camera bouncing against her chest. "You and your sick obsession. You just had to come here, didn't you? Chasing your stupid monsters." Ben flinched as if struck. "Chloe, no. I didn't know. I never thought." "You never thought?" she shrieked, her grief twisting into rage. "Jake is gone. He's gone because you led us into a nightmare." "That's enough," Mark snapped, though his authority was hollowed out by fear. Blaming each other won't get us out of here. But the trust was broken. Sarah looked at Ben, and for the first time, her scientific skepticism was replaced by a flicker of superstitious accusation. Mark, whose careful planning had been rendered utterly useless, felt the weight of his failure crushing him. They were no longer a team of seasoned hikers. They were four terrified strangers, isolated by their own fear and suspicion, trapped in a place that was actively, intelligently trying to destroy them. As their argument faded into ragged breath, a new sound cut through the whispers, a heavy, rhythmic thump, 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 like a giant, distorted heartbeat echoing from the fog just beyond their sight. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. The forest wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming for them. The rhythmic, heavy thumping paralyzed them, rooting them to the damp earth. It was the sound of a predator's deliberate approach, confident and unhurried. Closer and closer it came, a sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots, until it was just beyond the wall of fog that encircled their tiny glade. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was 1,000 times worse, thick with anticipation of a final, violent pounce. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Nothing happened. The oppressive quiet returned. "We can't keep running," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. The decision was born of pure desperation. "It's getting dark. We'll get separated and picked off. We need light. We need a fire. We stay here together." It was a flawed plan, a suicidal one, but it was the only thing that felt like an action. Numb with fear, they obeyed. Chloe fumbled in her pack for the fire starters, while Mark designated a small pit in the center of the glade. The greatest challenge was firewood. Everything was damp, and no one dared to venture more than a few feet into the menacing woods. "Sarah, Ben," Mark ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Gather anything you can from the edge right here. Don't go more than 10 feet. Stay in my sight." Hesitantly, Sarah and Ben began collecting fallen branches and twigs from the perimeter of the glade. The fog swirled around them, playing tricks on the eyes, making the familiar shape of a friend seem like a stranger for a split second. Ben gathered an armful of damp wood and turned to carry it back to Mark. He was gone for no more than 5 seconds. When he turned back to the spot where Sarah had been kneeling, a spot barely 15 feet away, she was gone. There had been no scream, no sound of a struggle, not even a snapped twig. The fog had swirled, and in that instant, she had been erased from existence. The small pile of sticks she had gathered lay undisturbed on the ground. "Sarah?" Ben's voice was a choked, quiet thing. Mark and Chloe looked up, their faces etched with confusion that instantly curdled into dawning horror. They scanned the impenetrable wall of white. "Sarah!" Mark bellowed, his voice cracking. But Ben wasn't looking for her anymore. His gaze was fixed on a particularly dense patch of mist directly where Sarah had been standing. The rhythmic thumping he'd heard earlier finally made sense. As he stared, the fog seemed to thin for a fraction of a second, revealing what stood within. It was tall, impossibly so, its form indistinct and wavering as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Its limbs were long and skeletal, ending what looked like cruel, jagged talons. It had no discernible features, save for 2 points of faint, pale light that hovered where a head should be. There were not eyes that saw, but glowing embers of cold, ancient malice that stared directly into his soul. Ben froze. He tried to scream, to warn the others, but his lungs wouldn't draw breath. His body was locked in a vice of pure, primal terror. He could only stand there, trembling, as the figure loomed in the mist, a silent, patient god of death that had come to collect its due. Ben's paralysis was shattered when Mark grabbed his shoulders, shaking him violently. "Ben, what is it? What do you see?" The physical jolt tore Ben back to reality. It was there," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger into the mist. "Tall, with eyes." Mark and Chloe spun around, peering into the swirling whiteness, but there was nothing. The monstrous figure had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving only the chilling certainty of his presence. Their pathetic attempt to build a fire was forgotten. Huddled together, back to back, the 3 survivors were now prisoners in the glade that had become a cage. And the hunter began to play with its prey. It started with the voices. "Guys, is that you?" The voice was Jake's, filled with a weak, cracking humor that was so familiar it was heartbreaking. It came from the darkness to their left. "I think I twisted my ankle. A little help, Jake?" Chloe whispered, her heart seizing with a desperate, impossible hope. "Don't listen," Mark commanded, his voice a low growl. "It's not him. It's a trick." But the entity was relentless. A moment later, Sarah's voice, clear and scientific, drifted from the right. The atmospheric density here is causing auditory hallucinations. Stay calm, it's a natural phenomenon. The voice was a perfect imitation, a cruel weaponization of her logic against them. It was trying to disorient them, to make them doubt each other, to turn them around, to separate them. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves came from a different direction, forcing them to spin in a slow, panicked circle, never knowing where to look. Then came the sound that broke them. It was Chloe who heard it first, a soft, whimpering cry from the edge of the fog. It was Sarah's voice again, but this time it was filled with pain. "Mark, please, I'm hurt. I'm right here. Sarah!" Chloe cried out, her grief and fear overwhelming Mark's warnings. She took one instinctive step toward the sound. That was all it took. One step. The fog seemed to surge, swallowing her in an instant. "Chloe, no!" Mark yelled, reaching out. But he was grabbing at empty air. For a moment, there was only the sound of the whispers. Then, from the spot where Chloe had been consumed, a single piercing scream of pure, soul-shattering terror ripped through the night. It was the sound of a human mind witnessing the absolute, unholy truth of what was hunting them. And then, it was cut off. Not faded, not muffled, but silenced. As if a switch had been flipped, plunging the forest into a dead, horrifying quiet. The silence where the scream had been was more terrifying than any sound. Mark and Ben stood frozen for a beat, the last two survivors. The game was over. This was the end. Primal instinct took over. Mark grabbed Ben's arm in a bruising grip, and without a word, they ran. They plunged blindly into the hostile, ever-changing woods, two souls fleeing a silent, waiting death. Their own ragged gasps, the only sound left in the world. Their blind, terrified flight ended abruptly as the forest floor gave way. They tumbled down a short, steep embankment, landing in a heap of mud and tangled thorns at the bottom of a narrow, sunken hollow. Trapped. The dense, thorny brush formed a natural cage around them, and the only way out was the way they had come in. As they struggled to their feet, they heard it, the slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump of its approach. It wasn't searching anymore. It knew exactly where they were. It emerged from the fog at the top of the embankment, and for the first time, they saw it clearly. The sight was a blasphemy against nature. It was impossibly tall and gaunt, its body a grotesque mockery of a human form, seemingly woven from shadow, rotted wood, and glistening black fungus. Its limbs were too long, bending at angles that bone should not allow. Its movement was a jerky, unnatural gait, each step punctuated by the sickening snap of twigs and the wet, guttural clicking that seemed to emanate from a gaping, pulsing hole in its torso. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless head that lolled on a thin neck. And the eyes, the 2 points of pale, glowing light, were voids of immense cold, sucking in all warmth and hope. It smelled of fresh graves and decaying leaves. The creature lowered its head, its burning stare fixing upon them, and the clicking sound intensified, joined by a low, vibrating hum that made their teeth ache. This was the god of the stone circle, the ancient hunger that had claimed their friend. As it began to descend into the hollow, its long, claw-like fingers scraping against the earth, Ben's mind, fractured by terror, latched on to the one thing that made sense: the carvings. The images from the stone circle flashed behind his eyes. The tall, hollow-eyed figures, the cowering humans, the rituals. He saw one panel with crystal clarity, a human figure, not running, not fighting, but holding something aloft. A torch. And in the carving, the creature was recoiling, its long arms shielding its empty face from the light. "Mark!" Ben screamed, his voice raw. "The fire, the carvings, they weren't worshipping it. They were keeping it back, with fire." The word sliced through Mark's panicked haze. Survival instinct, honed by years in the wild, took over. He ripped his backpack off and tore it open, his hands shaking violently as he searched for Chloe's fire-starting kit. The creature was halfway down the embankment now, its cold gaze promising an agonizing end. Mark found the flint and steel, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal. "Hurry!" Ben sobbed, pressing himself against the far wall of the hollow. The guttural clicking grew louder, closer. Mark struck the flint against the steel, his knuckles white. Once, twice, nothing but dead sparks. The ancient entity took another slow, deliberate step towards them, unfurling its shadowy claws. On the third strike, a weak spark finally caught on a piece of dry tinder. Mark had frantically pulled from his kit. A tiny, fragile flame flickered to life, but it was too little, too late. The shadow thing lunged, not at Ben, but at Mark, the source of the potential threat. A long, root-like arm shot out and wrapped around Mark's torso, lifting him effortlessly from the ground. The grip was unnaturally cold, and the crushing pressure stole the air from Mark's lungs. He felt his ribs creak, his strength draining away as if being siphoned by the creature's chilling touch. The guttural clicking was now deafening, echoing directly in his ear. Ben watched, paralyzed, as Mark struggled in the monster's grasp. But Mark wasn't defeated yet. With his free hand, he fumbled in his pack's side pocket, his fingers closing around a hard, cylindrical object, an emergency flare. It was their last chance. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he ripped the cap off and struck the igniter. A blinding, hissing torrent of crimson light erupted, painting the hollow in demonic shades of red and black. The creature shrieked a sound that was not of this world, a horrifying symphony of grinding rock and tearing ligaments. It recoiled violently from the intense magnesium glare, its pale, glowing eyes dimming as if in pain. It dropped Mark, who crumpled to the ground, gasping, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. The flare had worked. It held the monster at bay, forcing it back a few crucial feet. In that moment, Mark made his choice. He knew he was too injured to escape. His meticulous planning, his leadership, it had all led to this. But he could save one of them. He shoved the burning flare into Ben's hands. The heat was searing. "Take it," Mark coughed, blood trickling from his lips. "Keep it between you and it. Climb!" "Mark, no, I can't," Ben cried, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. "Go," Mark roared, using the last of his strength to push Ben toward the embankment. "Don't look back. Tell them what happened here. Now, Ben, run." Tears streaming down his face, Ben scrambled up the muddy slope, holding the blinding flare out like a sword. The creature hissed, shielding its featureless face, unable to advance into the light. Ben reached the top and risked a single glance back, a glance he would regret for the rest of his life. Mark, with a final, defiant yell, had thrown himself at the creature's legs, a desperate, selfless act to buy Ben a few more seconds. He saw the shadow thing envelop Mark, the red light of the flare reflecting off its writhing form. He heard a sickening, wet, crushing sound, and Mark's final, choked cry was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. Ben turned and ran, the ghastly echo of his friend's death spurring him on, clutching the fading light of the flare as if it were life itself. Ben ran. He didn't know for how long. Time had dissolved into a meaningless blur of terror and motion, measured only by the sputtering life of the flare in his hand. The brilliant crimson light that had been his shield began to flicker and wane, its lifeblood burning away. With every stutter of the flame, the menacing whispers and the sound of snapping branches seemed to creep closer from the oppressive darkness of his head. He ran harder, his lungs burning, thorns tearing at his skin. The horrifying image of Mark's sacrifice burned into his mind's eye. Then, with a final, pathetic hit, the flare bounced, plunging him into absolute blackness. A sob of pure despair escaped his lips, but he didn't stop. He pushed onward through the disorienting dark, fueled by the memory of Mark's final command. He ran for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the cold, root-like grip to seize him from the shadows. But it never came. Gradually, imperceptibly at first, the forest began to change. The malevolent, intelligent presence that had been suffocating him began to recede. The inky blackness softened to the pre-dawn gray of a normal night, and through the trees he saw the first faint hints of sunrise painting the eastern sky. The menacing whispers faded, replaced by the tentative chirp of an awakening bird. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He stumbled onward, his body a canvas of pain, until his foot caught on something hard. Not a root, but something man-made. He looked down and saw a rusted strand of barbed wire half buried in the earth a property line. He had made it. He was out of his domain. The realization didn't bring relief, only a complete and total system failure. The adrenaline that had propelled him for hours vanished, leaving a hollow void. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the damp leaves, the world spiraling into darkness. He was awoken by a gruff voice and the prodding of a boot. An old man in hunter's gear stood over him, his face a mixture of alarm and pity. Ben tried to speak, to explain, but all that came out was a stream of incoherent babbling about glowing eyes, stone circles, and his friends, Jake, Sarah, Chloe, Mark. The hunter, seeing the raw, unadulterated trauma in Ben's eyes and the torn, bloody state of his clothes, didn't press for answers. He simply wrapped a thick wool blanket from his truck around Ben's shivering shoulders and guided him into the passenger seat. As the truck rumbled down a dirt track and onto a paved road, Ben drifted in and out of consciousness. He was safe, he was out, but his mind was still trapped in those deep, dark woods. The last thing he saw before succumbing to the encroaching darkness was the flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance approaching a beacon from a world that could never possibly understand the nightmare he had survived. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of a hospital room, and later a quiet police interview room, Ben recounted his story. He spoke with the raw, desperate clarity of a man who has stared into the abyss. He told them everything. The shifting trails that defied their maps, the mimicked voices in the dark, the unnatural lights, and the sudden, silent disappearance of Jake. His voice cracked as he described the ancient stone circle, the grotesque carvings of the hollow-eyed entity, and the non-human tracks in the mud. He told them about the creature's horrifying appearance, its guttural sounds, and Mark's final, heroic sacrifice. The authorities listened patiently. A park ranger and the sheriff's deputy nodded, their faces etched with practiced sympathy. They offered him coffee. They told him he was brave, but in their eyes, he saw the truth. They didn't believe him. Not a word of it. Their questions were gentle, but their intent was clear. Son, you are suffering from severe dehydration and hypothermia. The mind can play tricks on you under that kind of stress. It's common for survivors to experience vivid hallucinations to cope with the trauma of losing their friends. The official story was already being written. 5 hikers got tragically lost in the remote section of the forest. 4 succumbed to the elements. Ben, the sole survivor, was suffering from profound psychological trauma. His tale of a monster was nothing more than a coping mechanism, a grim fairy tale his shattered mind had concocted to explain the unexplainable. They discharged him from the hospital into a world that no longer made sense. He was physically safe, but he had never been more alone. The forest, he discovered, had followed him home. The nights were the worst. Sleep offered no escape, only a recurring nightmare where he was back in the hollow, the flare sputtering out, the creature's cold, glowing eyes staring from the darkness. He would wake up screaming, the guttural clicking sound echoing in the quiet of his room. During the day, the paranoia was a constant companion. Every tall shadow at the edge of his vision was the entity looming. The rustle of wind in the trees outside his window sounded like the whispers from the woods. He saw its form in the twisted branches of an old oak, in the shape of a coat hanging on his door. He was a prisoner in his own life, haunted by a truth no one else would ever acknowledge. He had survived the Hoosier National Forest, but a part of him, the sane, trusting part that believed in a rational world, had been left behind, a permanent sacrifice to its ancient, hungry heart. Months bled into a season of gray, paranoid solitude. The official search for his friends had long been called off, their names added to the grim, ever-growing list of those claimed by the Hoosier National Forest. One afternoon, a package arrived, a sterile cardboard box containing the personal effects recovered from their first night's campsite. For weeks, Ben left it untouched, a tomb of memories he couldn't bear to open. But the need to know, to find something, anything, that wasn't just a traumatic memory, finally forced his hand. He sifted through the contents with trembling fingers, Mark's meticulously folded maps, one of Chloe's spare lens caps, a pressed leaf inside Sarah's scientific journal. Then he saw it. His digital audio recorder, which he always carried for his cryptozoology hobby. It was caked in mud but seemed intact. He'd completely forgotten he'd had it running in his pocket that final, terrible night. With a thudding heart, he cleaned it, charged it, and put on his headphones, isolating himself with the past. He skipped through hours of cheerful hiking and campfire chatter until he found the last file. The audio was distorted, filled with the hiss of wind and panicked breathing. He heard their argument after finding the stone circle. He heard his own terrified voice yelling about the fire. He heard Mark's final desperate order, "Run!" Then came the sickening, wet, crushing sound from his nightmares, followed by an unearthly shriek as the flare ignited. But the recording didn't stop there. After the sounds of his own frantic escape faded, the recorder captured something else. For 10 horrifying seconds, there was only the sound of the entity's guttural, wet clicking, terrifyingly clear. And then, a voice emerged from the static. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry of his own voice, whispering a single, distorted phrase over and over again. "You're one of us now, one of us now." A cold dread, colder than anything he'd felt in the forest, washed over him. He tore the headphones off as a strange, burning itch spread across his forearm. He pushed up his sleeve and stared in horror. There, under his skin, was a faint, dark discoloration, a web of lines that looked like the gnarled, twisted branches from the stone circle. It was a brand, a permanent scar. He finally understood. He hadn't escaped. He had been released, a carrier of the tale, a living testament to the forest power. The entity was still out there, patient and eternal, within the deep green heart of the Hoosier, waiting. And it had left a part of its ancient, malevolent soul inside him, a lingering whisper to remind him every single day that while he may have walked out of the woods had never, ever left him. And that is where Ben's story ends. Or perhaps where his new, haunted life truly begins. The official report remains unchanged. Mark, Sarah, Chloe, and Jake are listed as 4 more souls tragically lost to the unforgiving wilderness. Their disappearances attributed to disorientation and exposure. It's a neat, rational explanation for a world that refuses to look into the shadows. But we know the truth. You've heard it now, too. The account you've just listened to is a stark reminder that there are places in this world, ancient and wild, that operate on rules far older than our own. Places like the Hoosier National Forest hold mysteries that our modern science and logic cannot begin to comprehend. These are the thin places where the veil between what we know and what we fear grows fragile, and something else, something patient and hungry, can reach through. Ben and his friends were seasoned hikers, well equipped and experienced, but they made one fatal error. They assumed the only dangers were the one they could prepare for: the cold, the terrain, a wrong turn. They never imagined the forest itself could be the predator. So, the next time you're driving down a lonely highway late at night, the dark, monolithic shapes of a national park sliding past your window, or the next time you stand at a trailhead, feeling that primal pull to step off the beaten path and into the deep, welcoming silence of the woods, remember this story. Remember the mimicked voices, the shifting trails, and the glowing eyes in the mist. And ask yourself, do you dare venture into places where the whispers still hold untold secrets? The story of what happened deep within the Hoosier National Forest is just one of many that lie buried in the shadows of our world. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you want to hear more truths from the places that logic has abandoned, be sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss our next expedition into the dark. Let us know in the comments below if you've ever felt that unnatural quiet in the wilderness, that unshakable feeling of being watched. Your stories remind us that we are not alone. And if this tale left you with a chill you can't quite shake, hitting that like button lets us know you're ready to hear what else is lurking out there. Stay safe, and whatever you do, stay on the path, because the darkness is always listening and is always hungry.